Okay, so this is going to be a flash reading. Obviously, I know a lot about Michael Jackson, but I have not fully studied the chart all the way, but I already, when I looked at I glanced at it, there were definitely some things that I wanted to talk about. So first and foremost, I want to bring up the fact that 7:33 p.m. is the accepted time for when he is born. Apparently, it has an A rating on the lowest Rodden system for astrology. So we are going to go with this, and a lot of astrologers stand by this as well as his birth time. So we're going to go with it. Of course, we know when a birth time is by memory or autobiography, it could be a few minutes before, a few minutes behind. We don't fully know because a part of me feels like I would not have been surprised if that moon in Pisces was actually in the 12th house. So if it was off by a few minutes, it is very possible, but let's just go what we know. He's a Virgo. And if that Virgo's in that 6th house, that makes tons of sense. Why? Because work ethic. He was meticulous about his work. Michael Jackson was not a sloppy artist. Everything had to be done the way that he wanted it to. And he didn't do it as in a mean way, but it's like just because he was soft-spoken. Now, again, a lot of people say that wasn't his real voice. That would make a lot of sense. They would say his voice was actually a little bit deeper than that. That would make a lot of sense because that Mercury in Leo is in retrograde. So there being some issue with communication or voice when Mercury's in retrograde would not be surprising. Okay. But what we want to look at here is the fact that though we know his singing voice was legendary, so that really wasn't the concern. We're talking about his speaking voice. So, but that 6th degree makes a lot of sense to me as well. I do degrees theory, and that is a Virgo degree. So his energy, him having Virgo and Leo in the 6th house of work would make sense. Leo is entertaining. It is about the fun. It is about the creative process. Venus people, period, in 6th house like working. And that's why it's so important for them to find a place that they're very fond of, find a field that they enjoy, because Venus and Leo is going to give their all, especially the 17th degree, which is a relentless degree. It's also a Leo degree in the degree theory, right? But also what I find interesting is the sun can also represent the father. Now we know Joe Jackson put his sons to work at an early age. Even his daughter, Janet, was also an actress, but he was hardest on the boys. And that has been well documented by all the Jackson family and Joe even himself, right? And I find it interesting because if the sun in the chart can represent the father, that sun conjunct Pluto represents that harsh rule, that harshness. Y'all got to get up and practice. The sun being the 6th house. So yes, our sun represents us, our personality. It represents what we're conscious of. I'll get to the moon in a second, but that moon being conjunct that Pluto absolutely can make a lot of sense, okay? The sun, let me see what else the sun is doing. The sun is making somewhat of an opposition to the moon. Now, again, at the 14th degree, it's getting a little far apart. It's separating. But you could say that sun opposing that moon represents, one, the dynamic between the parents, very polarizing personalities. The mother, that's where I think a lot of them get the soft-spoken tone of voice from. Catherine, seemed like she was very nurturing, but also she was, more of following Joe's authority. It's a very traditional type of marriage. They also, were very religious. So there was a very traditional element to it where Catherine didn't really seem to challenge Joe all that much in how to handle the family business, how to handle the children. So, but even that sun opposing the moon, that can represent that, right? His relationship with his father, even that sun opposing moon, not being nurtured by the father, but definitely being poured into in terms of work ethic. In fact, there's a respect factor for his father. So even though there was allegations of abuse throughout the years, and we know the way in which parents parented and disciplined children back in the day would be considered abuse by many standards, but that sun conjunct Pluto in that 6th house, he still respected his father. He likely still felt like, but I'm still what I was today because he put us to work, because he knew how to focus on business, because of what he did. Even when you see interviews, Michael was very interesting where he would slip the truth out, right? He would say something. He had Saturn Sag in that 9th house, but he also was very clear in his respect for his father in terms of the career that he helped bred for him and his brothers, in terms of the working, teaching them how to work the industry as children. Now, again, Michael was very sensitive, and I think that's that Pisces ascendant and that Pisces moon. Now, if we move to the 1st house, we're now seeing the fact that, okay, moon conjunct the ascendant makes sense for a person who wears their emotions on their sleeve. Not that he was overly emotional, but he was very sensitive, and I think there is a difference between being emotional and sensitive. And he was sensitive to cruelty. Michael didn't like anyone being taken advantage of in terms of like money, finances, very low tolerance for cruelty, very low tolerance for abuse, right? Wanting to kind of rescue animals and rescue children and all those things. And we do know that there's, over the years he was accused of things and he had that scandal attached to him, for a long time, right? And so if you think though about the moon being in Pisces, that is where the creativity, the sensitivity, the ability to touch people through his music, but it came through his pain. It came through his own feelings of restriction, where his music often represented things he could not quite experience for himself, wanting to have that childhood. I speak to that because if the moon is also a part of his creative process, look at that. The 5th house of creativity, based on this chart, is ruled by Cancer. Well, the moon rules over his 5th house. So that creativity, using his past to be successful, 10th house degree, right, of Capricorn. That not that the 10th degree in the degree theory is what I'm referring to. So, but even look at the moon squaring Saturn, right? Something he didn't quite get in his nurturing. Saturn representing restriction. Saturn in Sagittarius. Sagittarius has freedom. He didn't have a lot of freedom as a child. He wasn't able to be a child. He had to put himself into the forefront, right? That moon being in that 1st house. He's always had to be shown, to be seen, right? Even if we did look at this through the 10th degree lens. Now, again, the chart ruler would be Neptune. Neptune in 8th house could speak to how he was able to take situations and allow himself to speak through his truth and speak through the things that he's undergone through Neptune and Scorpio. We know eventually Michael was very candid about how he felt about the music industry. He was very critical. That's a Mercury and Leo. A Mercury and Leo person is not going to stay quiet for long. Though he had artistry in how he presented himself, that was very important. Okay? Those things are very important. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind there. It's like that Mercury and Leo that's speaking out against the industry and about his, making sure he has rights to his publishing and other artists, and really just exposing the work, exposing what's really going on. I think it's also a part of this Saturn in Sagittarius, that ability for Saturn, which we know can be connected to systems of authority. In Sagittarius, him speaking the truth, sharing the truth at a cost sometimes, right? But also Saturn conjunct the midheaven, I think is very interesting because at Sagittarius, that represents his legacy. That represents his ability to be worldwide. That's a very Sagittarius type of situation, to be worldwide, to be renowned, to be loved across the globe. People were crying for him. He went to Asia. Like, this is, people had t-shirts of him in like certain countries in Africa. Like, he had a global impact. And I do think that would make sense through here, through this energy with the Sagittarius. Even the Jupiter in Libra, Jupiter being the ruler, being in the 8th house, him deeply touching people. It's not just like, oh, he's a pop star. He was a pop star, the king of pop, right? When you call the king of pop, I'm like, okay, we see he has all this Leo energy. That makes a lot of sense to be the king of pop, right? And it's not something he called himself. It's something that just was, a part of him. I also think it's very interesting. Many of us may, whether we were there or not, you heard of the Pepsi commercial where he got injured and his hair caught on fire. I think that's very interesting because Leo is associated with hair, and he has, look at this, Uranus at 13th degree. 13th degree is Aries. Aries can be, something violent. It could be something brash. It could be something blunt. And also Uranus is sudden accidents, sudden things. So Uranus and Leo, hair, in the 6th house of work. And this is how literal astrology can be sometimes. It is conjunct Venus. Venus is the appearance. So I'm not saying this was meant to be that he was supposed to be injured. It could have meant maybe a transit was happening at that time or something passing through. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it was meant to be that thing to happen to him, that incident. I'm saying that sometimes astrology is that literal, where if something was going to happen, it's going to happen at a certain point in time when the planets are activated. I think the fight over money and his estate and all those things is this Mars in Taurus. And we know Mars is considered to be a detriment in the sign of Taurus, 22nd degree Capricorn, like him having to work for his money, like to not have people take what he's worked for. That is that Mars energy. That 26th degree, that's that wealth that he has. But Mars obviously rules over his 2nd house, the ability to make money, but Mars and Taurus, it's still being slow, or there's still being, and not slow in the fact that he didn't have his mansion, he had his statues, he had his animals, he had whatever you could imagine, but Mars and Taurus can represent there being some type of battle financially, or there being things that were due to him that he didn't necessarily always get right away. This is also how literal it is. The Mars conjunct the 27th degree of his third house cusp of siblings. 27 is a Gemini degree for those of us that do degree theory. I'm not going to go into what 27 means right now, but look at that. Either way, let's say you don't do degree theory, right? Either way, that Taurus energy on that third house, that Venus in Leo, sixth house, it's also this idea of having to provide for others, money, monetary things, right? So him working, a lot of times it was, and I think like he didn't shut a lot of people out. I read somewhere, and I would have to verify this, that at some point he was paying one of his brother's child support or something like that. And I'm like, look at that. That's Mars and Taurus. Mars and Taurus, it's like, begrudgingly, it's like, I don't want to have to do this, but I feel like I have to support and I have to help others. And some of this could be also, he may have felt drained at certain moments in time in his life, feeling like he had to, again, I'm only using astrology to say this, I didn't know him personally, but this is what this could show in this chart, is that the money he made wasn't just for him. He had to, his success was, obviously other people benefited from it, but sometimes he felt he had to work so hard for other people as well. I think it's interesting. Let's see what else that I want to talk about here. He didn't always feel that he was accepted or that he belonged. 19th degree, like it was hard sometimes to form like truly close, like he had close relationships with certain people, but it was very selective. But Chiron being in Aquarius in the retrograde, like even though he was beloved across the globe, there was always this feeling of not feeling like he quite fit in. And that also may have started from childhood. But look at this Chiron, this is why I do Placidus, y'all, because I like the degrees on the houses. All right, Placidus will give you extra insight. Look at this, the fourth house, the 19th degree. This means that Chiron is literally trining Chiron, the wounded healer, his fourth house cusp. Gemini, brothers. It started when he was younger, not feeling accepted, feeling different, feeling not, ordinary. Also, again, we know growing up can be hard, right? In adolescence, I know he had like pimples. He said his dad teased him about his nose. And eventually he did get cosmetic surgery, but eventually, multiple times. But that started when he was younger. Look at this, Venus, which is our appearance, right? Those that how we look, what our aesthetic is, what our vibe is, what we wear, those things. Of course, Venus and Leo, he's the king of pop. He has the glove. He does all these things, right? I also think it's very important to note that the sign most associated with plastic surgery changing what one really looks like is Pisces. We know Neptunian energy. Neptune is his chart ruler. 8th house is the house of surgeries. I know it's an A rating. So an A rating on the lowest Rodin is second to AA. AA is like birth certificate in hand. You see the time, right? And even then, sometimes people round up and round down, the doctors, right? But anyway, the point that I'm making is like, this rings so true. Like his chart ruler is in the 8th house, which deals with surgery. And then he's a Pisces rising. His ascendant is conjunct his moon. A moon in Pisces first house energy would have given a different image. We saw him change throughout the years. We saw, because of cosmetic surgery, also because of his battle with vitiligo. And so, at some point he's like, well, I want to match my skin. I'm a performer. I have to do this, right? But also the changes in hair, the changes in just overall appearance, facial structure, all of those things. It's a very Piscean thing. And I'm not saying all Pisces would go to that extreme, right? But I'm saying that, even if people looked at him when he was younger and like, thought like, oh, he was a handsome kid, or he was a handsome adult, or he one surgery, he didn't need to get many. A lot of people felt that way, but at the same time, he wasn't content with what he saw, right? And in certain areas, and just certain, things and decisions he made for his appearance. Okay. And, we're here for his music. We're here for his music, but I want to really stamp that about this energy really showing up in terms of, remember, Neptune and Pisces energy is the illusion. It's not know him for his aesthetic, for how he wore his hair. Yes, eventually he did have some, skin pigmentation issues because of vitiligo, which were causing him to have to bleach certain parts of his skin. But when we look here, look at that. Venus is making an opposition to his Chiron. So that sensitivity around his looks was something that started from his childhood. I know he spoke often. His dad would say certain things about him. Also, when he went from a little kid to like a teenager, from Jackson 5 fame to being a teenager, people would make comments about his appearance or his acne. So he was highly sensitive. The moon in first house is a sensitive place altogether, but that moon in Pisces makes you very, very, it impacts you more. We're all impacted sometimes if someone says something, but for Pisces energy, it is highly sensitive and then prone to, sometimes people want to adapt and change themselves based off the things that people say, especially when we're dealing with this idea of physicality, what you look like. But also his appearance is something legendary. Venus, look at that. Venus is making a trine to his Saturn and his midheaven. So we know what Michael Jackson looks like. He's legendary, his image, all those different things. Okay, so with movies, there's really never typically a like time the movie, like, you know, with a movie release, there really usually isn't like a, you could use midnight, but like, you know, there's no like, oh, this movie was available at 2:30 p.m. So like all I really did was pull the current planets or the planets that were in place on April 24th, just to see an overlay on Michael's birth chart on like the movie's impact. Does the movie make any significant aspects to his natal chart? So, you know, ideally I would have liked to see maybe some 10th house, 9th house energy. You know, if we're talking about like something public, something about a legacy, especially through 10th, 9th through something widespread, but that's okay. I'm hearing that it's doing well with numbers, okay? And so, you know, it coming out during Taurus season, you know, think about Taurus energy, which is about things that are authentic and grounded. And there's a lot of things they had to go back and forth for to even produce this movie in the first place. So I do think it's something interesting to note that it came out during Taurus season is interesting to me because, you know, typically, ideally, you would want to see a movie come out during, you know, again, I'm not saying, I don't think they consulted astrology or needed to, but near someone's, you know, making an aspect to their midheaven, their sun, you know, Virgo season maybe, but whatever, you know. What I do think is interesting is that the moon is in Leo, was in Leo when the movie came out, and that obviously we, you know, not using the exact degrees, but that could be making some type of conjunct to his Venus, his Uranus. Eventually when the moon, you know, moves up many degrees, it would have also made a conjunct to his Mercury. So that can be positive at the time. I always say when we're doing any type of transit reading, the moon is a great timing technique for something when you know a specific date. If I'm doing a regular transit reading for someone today, the moon's going to move, right? So when it's an event that's happening, that's when the moon is the most important in a transit reading, okay? Jupiter, you know, in Cancer would be aspecting his natal chart, not aspecting his natal chart, I'm sorry. Jupiter in Cancer was exalted, 18th degree, that's Virgo degree, would be in that 5th house of creativity. So that transit can support it. So even after someone's long gone, anything that has to deal with that person, you can still pull up a transit chart for that person's natal chart, especially when we look at the fact that there's multiple factors to someone's impact and influence. What I find now I want to shift, because I'm not going over this whole thing. What I find very interesting here, all right, and again, before I jump into that, the super Aries stellium that we're going through right now, you know, that could be really good in terms of launching things, starting things, you know, utilizing that Aries energy for things that are bold, things that productions, events, movies, releases. But Aries energy, we know, tends to be very much like go forward, go fast, move. And so I even wonder if there's probably someone on the team or in the family that thought the movie went like they should have waited, or there's some detail or something that was missing or something like that. Because Aries energy doesn't really think too much about things. It just goes off instinct. But, you know, there's a lot of energy here showing that, you know, you can utilize that at that time. I wonder if it was somebody feels it was rushed. But anyway, what I find interesting here is that Venus is in Gemini. Okay. Now, here's why it's important. Let me tell you. So Jafar Jackson, who is Michael's nephew, okay, he's playing Michael in the movie. Jafar is Jermaine's son, okay? What I find very interesting here is when I looked up his chart. So Jafar was born July 25th, 1996. He is a Leo. He's an early degree Leo. His Leo energy is the 2nd degree, and it's interesting because his Mercury is also in Leo. And a lot of people felt he did a good job portraying Michael. I have not seen the movie yet, but a lot of people thought he did a good job. And I think he probably did or could have, because in order to do it well, it's not, okay, it's great to be related to him, and be able to really channel that authentically, which is different than a person that's never met the person before. Of course, there are many great actors that could portray someone, but I do think, energetically, him being a Leo and having so much energy that can be aligned to Michael was probably helpful. All right. What also I find interesting is he's a Venus in Gemini, Jafar. And the transit currently, Venus is currently in Gemini. So when you're looking at these things, yes, I put an overlay over Michael's chart, but also we want to look at anyone that's involved in a situation as well to just see how the energy lines up. What's also interesting is Jafar also has Saturn in Aries. So when we look at Michael's chart, you don't see a lot of prominent indicators of the movie or the success yet or anything like that. You really can't see it all that much. But it is really more aligned to Jafar, who's playing him. So this could be a pivotal moment in his career, perhaps, to be able to play his uncle, who is obviously a beloved music icon. What else? Let me see if there's anything else with Jafar chart. Now, when I look at Jafar's chart, I don't really see too much I don't have his birth time, but just his, planetary placements. I don't see anything else super aligned that I want to talk about, except for the fact that he has Uranus in Aquarius retrograde. But that means that Uranus in Aquarius is currently making an aspect to Uranus in Gemini. Okay, so just, there's going to be maybe unexpected opportunities or situations that occur because of this. Yes, he's been in the public eye before. Yes, he is a part of a famous family. But I do wonder what this trajectory will look like for Jafar moving forward.